Hello, lovers and lumberjacks. My name is TB Skyen, and we've been discussing the Shadow Isles a bunch on the channel recently because the Mordekaiser rework is probably, at least if I had to take a guess, probably going to be the next major content release coming out for League of Legends. And along with him, Riot have been making a little bunch of changes to some of the champions on the Shadow Isles and adding a few new lore stories and doing just a little bit of what seems to be modernization on the conception of the Shadow Isles and their champions. And my suspicion, or at least my hope, is they'll be using Mordekaiser as a reason to do a major, not necessarily like a full rework of the Shadow Isles lore, but like a major pass on making the Shadow Isles lore fit together and clarifying its thematic role in the League of Legends universe, because that's something that Riot have been on a bit of a kick with over the past few years. They have been modernizing like Piltover, Son, Demacia, Noxus, the Freljord, Shurima, Targon. They've sort of been taking passes at all of those regions to try and bring them up to scratch to a modern storytelling standard. And the Shadow Isles kind of need that because traditionally they've just kind of been the ghost place. Like, oh, this Shadow Isles is where the undead are, and also the ghosts and all the spooky champions. They're there, and there's mist that kills you, and it's never really been very clear what the Shadow Isles were supposed to sort of holistically be about in the same way that Demacia and Noxus have these clear thematic roles in the universe. So I'm hoping that the Mordekaiser rework is at the very least going to be a step in the process of kind of clarifying what the Shadow Isles are supposed to be in the grand narrative of League of Legends. Anyway, sort of in preparation for the Mordekaiser rework to come out, I've been taking a look at all the other champions on the Shadow Isles, and we've finally gotten to Maokai, the Twisted Treant. So, what's the deal with him? Well, Maokai's an old champion. He's from, I think, sometime in 2011, and the reason why he's called the Twisted Treant is because he is from the Twisted Tree line, or at least he was back in the day. His old lore, when he was first released, was that he was like just an old tree on the Twisted Tree line that got accidentally brought to life with some magic, and he was like, "Why am I alive? I am an abomination of nature. Please kill me." And the summoners of the League of Legends were like, "No, you're cool. We want to use you for champion matches." And so they did that. And Maokai was like, "I'm gonna find a way to stop being animated and alive if it kills me, to kill me." And that was, it wasn't exactly a strong lore, but if I remember correctly, he was basically released as a promotional champion for the Twisted Tree line back when that was the thing. That was before the Shadow Isles, I think, even really existed as a region. And then subsequent to the grand lore retcon of 2014, he was added to the Shadow Isles because he's kind of a spooky champion and became a fixture on those islands, but he wasn't originally designed for them. So, what's the modern state of his lore? Well, as usual in these videos, we're going to be looking at his biography first, and the color story that's associated with him, and then we'll move on to his character design and discuss a little bit about what kind of character design he is, and like whether he could be improved, and what's the aesthetic that underlies him, and stuff like that. So, Maokai's modern lore. So, once upon a time, before the Blessed Isles were the Shadow Isles, and before the Blessed Isles were even the Blessed Isles, they were just isles. They were just like a bunch of rock and clay in the middle of the sea where nothing lived and there was absolutely nothing on there. And then, for whatever reason, Maokai turned up. Like, he was just sort of created, and he turned up on the Blessed Isles like, "I am a nature spirit," and looked around and was like, "There's literally no nature here. It's just rocks and clay and sand and dirt and nothing of interest whatsoever." So Maokai is like, "Well, this sucks." And he starts wandering around looking for, like, a flower or what. It's just something of interest. Eventually, he stumbles upon a magical, life-giving spring. And he's like, "Well, that seems pretty cool, and I'm thirsty," so he drinks it. Like, he drinks quite a lot of it anyway, and finds that with the power of this life-giving spring, he can create life on the Shadow Isles. He can plant trees, he can make flowers bloom, and he can basically turn this incredibly boring series of rock in the ocean into a paradise-like nature preserve, just full of trees and plants and life and goodness, and all of the things are gonna be nice, and nature spirits everywhere. Yay! So he spends the next however many hundreds of years basically doing that. Now, eventually humans show up, and normally when humans show up to a natural paradise, the first thing they do is they just set about ruining the hell out of it, just as much as possible, try and fuck all of the things up about it. To Maokai's surprise, or maybe not surprise because he doesn't know that yet, to everyone's surprise, the humans don't do that. They show up, "Oh, this is a wonderful magical nature land. We should definitely not corrupt that with magic or do anything incredibly stupid and human that would jeopardize this nature paradise because that would be bad for everyone. So they settle down and they just do like good living in harmony with nature stuff. Like they don't disturb the nature spirits, they try and not cut down too many trees and stuff, and they generally try to not act like massive dickheads. Something that we could learn a lot from in our modern society today. And Maokai eventually is like, well, these humans seem okay, so you know what, I'll tell them a few magic secrets and stuff, and you know what, I'll even tell them about the magic life-giving spring, because that would probably be nice to know. And it's not like anything could possibly go wrong just because the humans know about the magic life-giving spring. And then the Ruined King shows up. Now, we've talked about in the Callista and Hecarim video specifically about why the Ruined King shows up on the Blessed Isles, but basically, his wife is dead, and he's like, make my wife not dead anymore, and the inhabitants of the islands are like, that sounds a lot like necromancy, and necromancy is bad, and then the king starts killing the hell out of absolutely everyone. Eventually, the king finds his way to the magical spring and puts his queen's corpse into the magic spring, hoping to revive her. He succeeds, except, like, her body was still kind of rotten and full of poison that killed her originally, so she reanimates as basically a suffering corpse begging for death every moment of her life, and the king is like, oh, I have made a big mistake. And he's like, he cast a spell, and he's trying to do the right thing here. He's trying to undo the his revival of the queen, and he's trying to kill himself in the process because he realizes, okay, I've gone kind of stupid and crazy and probably shouldn't be around anymore. The problem is, he's standing in the middle of one of the greatest repositories of magical artifacts on the entire planet, and his spell causes a massive chain reaction that ruins everything, just ruins absolutely everything. He turns the entire Blessed Isles into an enormous, festering misery of death. Just a huge, he turns them into the Shadow Isles, basically. It's that everything dies, everyone dies, everything gets fucked up, everything is bad, everything's terrible, nothing is good anymore. Entirely because he was a stupid, dumb idiot. Maokai senses from far away that, oh, the humans have screwed up, haven't they? So he decides to drink as much of the magic spring as he possibly can before it can be corrupted by the stupid, idiot humans who cast the stupid spell. He manages to survive the ruination of the Shadow Isles, despite them being, pretty good at killing people. He has the magical life-giving waters inside him, they protect him, but his body is twisted into something that looks kind of horrifying and Shadow Isles-ish, basically his current character design, because, you can't be on the Shadow Isles without being somewhat affected by it. Now, waking up from the ruination, Maokai's like, well, okay, literally everything I have worked my entire existence to create has been destroyed and killed by these stupid-ass humans, so I am going to be very, very angry now. Maokai just basically is like, I'm gonna kick the ass of every single available ghost, and then I'm gonna kick some more ass, and then I'm gonna turn the Shadow Isles back into the Blessed Isles because fuck you. And that's basically what he's been spending the last several hundred years doing since the ruination. He's just been doing that, just trying to destroy as many ghosts as possible and revive life and protect it wherever he can find it. Unfortunately, however powerful Maokai is, he's up against, kind of a lot of dead people, and he hasn't managed to make much progress, but he is so spectacularly angry that he doesn't really care. He's just gonna keep doing that forever until he can get his Blessed Isles back, and it's literally the only thing he cares about. So, the story that's associated with Maokai is Nightbloom, and it's basically, like a lot of the color stories for Champions, it's a story about how Maokai spends his time. Like, what's his daily life like? What's his primary character conflict like? What's it like being Maokai? Turns out, being Maokai kind of sucks. It's, in fact, kind of miserable. A lot of the stories about him wandering around the Shadow Isles kind of just being sad and miserable and angry and upset and unhappy because he's on the Shadow Isles and he remembers what they used to be like, and that's not great. Then one day he comes across a living flower, which is something highly unusual on the Shadow Isles where everything is death and everything dies. A single living flower has managed to push its way up through the soil to bloom for one single night before its life cycle ends, and it dies. And Maokai is like, this is the first flower I have seen in 500 goddamn years. If anyone so much as touches it, I will kill literally everyone. I don't care if you're dead already, I will make you dead again. He basically gets really, really pissed and has a massive pitched battle with every single ghost in a 100-mile radius, who are all converging on this flower to try and destroy it because it contains life and there's nothing ghosts like more than consuming life. He manages to protect the flower, it manages to bloom, live out its full life cycle, and then Maokai basically has to retreat because, That's a lot of ghosts. He can't destroy all of them. And, you know, sometimes you have to have discretion be the better part of valor. But meeting that flower, seeing that it exists, seeing that life can possibly survive on the Shadow Isles reinvigorates his faith and his hope, and spurs him on to just be angrier than ever and kick as much ghost ass as possible until he can make that a reality across the entire Shadow Isles. So, how good of a job does Maokai's character design do of communicating all of this? Well, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. See, Maokai, as I said at the start, was originally designed to be a promotional champion or a tie-in champion who existed on the Twisted Tree line. He existed as a result of summoner magic that had gone wrong. He was brought to life by humans in a terrifying magical accident that he kind of wants to reverse and destroy. And for those purposes, his character design is actually kind of perfect. But in the modern conception of his lore, Maokai is essentially the creator god of the Blessed Isles. Like, there are no gods on Runeterra, we know this, but he's as close as you get. He's basically the guy who planted all the trees. He's the guy who made the Blessed Isles the Blessed Isles. He's the progenitor of all life. He's a nature spirit above all else. He existed there thousands of years before humans ever came anywhere near it. And that's his basic nature is an embodiment of the Shadow Isles themselves. And in that sense, his character design is a little bit of a mixed bag for me, because Maokai, to me, doesn't really look like a progenitor nature spirit. Not even a corrupted progenitor nature spirit. He doesn't look like he was originally a nature spirit. He looks like he's a tree that had, like, some human stuff added to it by magic, and now it's walking around. Or rather, he doesn't even really look like a tree. Let me explain what I mean. So, here's Maokai's character model, and there's a couple of things that spring into my eyes immediately about it. First of all, he's wearing a loincloth. Because why? Does he have a tree dick? I mean, not as far as I can tell. And why would he even have one? Why is he wearing a loincloth? He's also wearing a belt. Like, you can kind of see it here, right? This little gnarled, twisted bit of greenery, that wood that's around his waist, that is a belt that he's wearing, and the acorn that's dangling from his tree branch. Now, in his oldest lore, this was a lantern that was attached to him in order to make sure that everybody could recognize him as a living tree, as a serve as a kind of warning that this is one tree that you don't want to piss up, because it will punch you in the face. And that kind of carries through into a lot of his design aesthetic. You can kind of see it on his face here. This face doesn't really look like something that grew out of anything. Like, it doesn't look like a natural growth, even a natural growth that has been twisted. This looks like a mask. This looks like a mask that has been carved, and you can see it in that sort of carving design that's positioned on the center of his forehead. You can see it in the way that he has this clearly defined jaw with the teeth that are going on. He's got this nose clearly defined. He's got eyebrows. He's got eyes. All of this looks like a human design. It looks like something a human would come up with. And the same thing goes for the face that sits on the side of his gauntlet. This looks like something a human carved. And it goes for his belt thing as well, where these little details, like, I think they're maybe supposed to look like knots in wood, like gnarled wood, but they look like they've been carved. Everything about him looks like it has been carved, like it has been sanded down, like it has been smoothed out, rather than something that grew wild and free and was then twisted into an unnatural shape. He looks a lot more like either a human being with a tree texture applied to it, like, well, not a human being, but a humanoid creature, like a mammal, an animal creature that has had a tree texture applied to it, that is wearing a tree costume, rather than a tree that has been twisted into the shape of a human. And that's sort of the major problem with Maokai, is that all of these design features are actually kind of excellent for his old conception as this, tree on the Twisted Tree line that was twisted into human shape by human magic. But that's not who the current Maokai is. The current Maokai is an ancient nature spirit / demigod that existed long before anything human ever came anywhere near the islands, before any animal life ever came near the islands, and which was then twisted into a sort of corrupted shape by magic caused by humans, but which is still fundamentally itself, right? Which hasn't been corrupted, because that's the thing about Maokai's old story was he was a tree, and then powerful human magic completely twisted everything about him. Like, it completely overtook him. It twisted the hell out of him. It ruined everything that used to be him. But that's not his news story. His news story is this human magic kind of swept over him, and it messed with his outsides a little bit, but on the inside, in his core, the central part of his being is still nature. It's still a plant spirit. It's still a nature spirit. Not human, not animal, not man-made, but the spirit of plant life and nature. And that, to me, just doesn't come across very well with this particular character design, and it comes across even less well with his saplings, which, again, they have 2 legs and 2 arms, they have eyebrows, they have eyes, they have mouths. They are little human heads with a tree texture applied to them, rather than looking anything like actual saplings that have been twisted into like a ghostly sort of semi-magical shape. At least that's how I interpret it. And to give you sort of an example, Riot have had a second pass at the idea of a tree man, right? Of having a tree ant with Ivern, where you can see much more explicitly they incorporated elements of plant-likeness into him and based their design on the idea of being plant-like with some human features twisted into it rather than the other way around. This comes across in the way that his animation and his stance, but also just his character model resembles a long, thin, sort of willowy tree with a tree crown at the top with the branches branching out and little, mushrooms and stuff growing on it. He looks much more like a tree that has sort of taken on a human form rather than a human form that has been carved into a tree by some, crazy carpenter. In terms of making Maokai look more like a nature spirit and less like, a human that carved a man out of wood, I kept thinking about the tree ants from Lord of the Rings. These are some of the tree ants that were in, I believe, the 2 towers. And you can see here how the designers of these particular tree ants took a very different approach to incorporating the difference between, making it look humanoid and making it look like a tree. And one of the things they focused on was obscuring the face. The face is the primary feature of all humanoid character designs. Like, the first thing the human brain looks for when it looks at any character that it's supposed to relate to is a face. It looks for the eyes first, and then it looks for the rest of the face. Like, we're literally neurologically programmed to look for faces, which is why you have subreddits like Pareidolia, which are basically just all about faces in things, like seeing, oh, those windows are sort of aligned, so it looks like a face, and hey, that light outlet looks like it has a face, and hey, that chair looks like it has a face. Basically that. And here, they're messing a little bit with it by obscuring the faces of these creatures. Now, you can kind of see how on this one, let's zoom in a little further, you can kind of see how on this one, the big sort of mushy branch mess on the top there is supposed to look a little bit like a beard, and there's sort of a nose-ish, and there's a little bit like some eyes there, kinda, and you can see the same thing happening here. You can see this approximation of a mustache and a little bit of a beard, and the nose and the eyes, but it also kind of looks like it could just be your mind playing a trick on you, right? It could just be, oh, I'm just kind of seeing a face there, but there isn't really a face there. And that carries through to this guy as well, where you can see they're using the leaves that are hanging down from his branches, as well as sort of the gnarled tree bark-like texture of his face, to kind of obscure the idea of a face, which is sort of... And that's where you get this thing where it's like, oh, this is, first and foremost, this is a tree, but because I'm looking for faces, I'm finding one in it. And that was something that I always really liked about the Lord of the Rings tree ants, is that they did such a good job of looking like trees first, with human aspects sort of grown into them second. And you can kind of see that also in the way that their feet are expressed. You can see they have these clearly defined tree roots, rather than being like feet that are just kind of wood-ish. You've got these clear tree roots things going on. Another good example of a way that you can kind of break away from the idea of this tree golem idea comes from Diablo 3, of all things, a game which actually has very strong character design in a lot of its monsters. This is a pine devil tree ant from, I think it's the Tristram area, where you encounter those, where you can see here that we're still working with the idea it's got 2 limbs and it's got sort of face features going on, but look at the way, for instance, its legs are defined. Rather than having 2 clearly defined legs, it's just using its roots to walk around. Rather than having 2 arms that are located, in the sense that shoulders would be located. Here we have one branch down here, which has been twisted into this sort of claw-like feature with a couple of long things on it that look more like the roots than they look like hands. And then further up here, like without any sense of anatomy, we have another tree branch that has been twisted also into a thing of completely different length with a completely different anatomy to it. Not an arm, like not an arm that has had a tree texture applied to it, but a tree branch that has been sort of twisted into the shape of an arm, mounting out in these two fingers. And you can see again here, playing around with the idea of physical features. You have the mouth on top, but the eye is down below, because again, this is not an animal. This is not a living creature in the sense of like being a mammal or a rodent or a bird or whatever. This is a plant. This is a tree that has had some human features forced into it by evil magic. And that's something I'm really kind of missing with Maokai's design in terms of the new lore that he's supposed to be embodying. This idea that instead of a human mask applied to a big hulking Gollum shape that doesn't look like a tree, that doesn't look like it's a plant that grew up out of the ground and was then twisted into a humanoid shape, but which looks like a person wearing tree armor or something along those lines. Like the huge arm that he's got here, it looks like a gauntlet. It looks like he's wearing a giant glove on his arm. It doesn't look like it's just his arm that happens to have grown really big. Right? You see where I'm coming from? You can even see it kind of in the way that the fingers are attached to the big arm, is that they look like fingers. They don't look like branches that are growing out of the hand. They look like fingers that are attached to the hand with joints. And that's sort of my main problem with Maokai, is that his new lore pushes his design much, much, much further along the axis of being, you are a nature spirit. You are a thing made from nature that has had a little bit of that has had kind of a human skin sort of vaguely stretched across it. But rather that you are a human thing that has had a nature skin stretched across it, if you see what I mean. And that's something, when and if Maokai gets himself a full visual and gameplay update, I would like to see him pushed much more in the direction of something that looks like a plant that has been vaguely forced into human shape, rather than the other way around. But I think that's about all the complaints I have about Maokai as a champion, which means it is time to move on to the boring part of my job, which is to tell you that you can hit the subscribe button, the like button, the comments, and the bell icon, and all the other YouTube buttons, which is all good for me because, well, that means my numbers go up, and YouTube doesn't kill my channel, which I would appreciate because I like doing this thing for a job, even if it's not very lucrative. Speaking of lucrative, if you want to support the channel directly, you can head on over to Patreon and support me with anything. Like, literally, if you have $1 a month, you can sign up for that, and that would be very, very helpful to me. If you don't want to sign up for a monthly subscription thing, then you can give me like a one-time tip with some of the tip jars that are linked down in the description, where you can say, hey, good job, you made a good video, here, have $1 in return for that, or $2, or whatever. And as I say at the end of my videos, for content creators like me, $1 from a member of our audience means the same as like 1,000, 2,000 views on a video, or tens of thousands of views when it comes to like ad impressions on a website. So whether it's me or whether it's some other creator that you enjoy whose work you like, please consider supporting them even with very small amounts, because they actually do make a tremendous amount of difference, and they make it much easier for us to do our jobs and to pay our rent and to just, you know, make it through life without being slaves to the algorithms, without being slave to ad revenue and stuff like that. Of course, if you don't want to do that, or you can't, believe me, I understand. Like, the times are tight all over, and there's nobody in the world who understands better what it's like to be broke than an online internet content creator. I can promise you that, so we will never be upset with you for that. Take care of yourself first, and never feel bad about not being able to support, because watching the videos, commenting, liking, like doing all the free stuff that you can do to support a channel is more than enough. Of course, if you have not enjoyed this video, well, then there's a dislike button down below that you can click on. Now, the dislike button long ago was cursed by an evil witch. So now, occasionally on moonless nights when there's wolf howls in the air, it will sprout a face and whisper terrible secrets and threats into your ears at night if you dare to touch it or click upon it. Now, as far as I know, none of its curses have ever actually come true. Like, it tried to curse me to turn into a tree, but all that really happened is I grew like a couple of leaves from one of my fingers, and then I, you know, can just cut those off with a nail clipper. It's really not that bad. Another time, it basically tried to turn all food into dirt in my mouth, which was like, it was like vaguely you know how sometimes like occasionally if you get like a little grain of sand in your teeth and it sort of crunches around in there, that happened a little bit, but then it kind of stopped again. I don't know, maybe it got bored or just kind of forgot about it. So if you click it, just, you know, be careful if it has a face on it and starts to whisper threats at you, but don't be too concerned about it unless, of course, it's a, you know, nocturnal full moon on the 12th of the 12th in some year that ends in 12, because as we all know, 12 is a magical number and something magically amplified powers, and then maybe you'll get turned into like an actual tree sapling and you'll have to go on a vision quest across some magical dimension to find a wizard who can turn you back into a human. And it's like a whole thing. You can find a guide online, like they've posted some tutorials. It's not that hard anymore, but you know, you just want to be ready for that and plan like a weekend around it if that thing is going to happen to you. Anyway, thank you very much for watching.